Greetings, truth seekers. Paranormal M welcomes you to a realm where reality and mystery collide. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and be prepared to be immersed in our latest mind-bending tales. We hope you're ready for a journey that transcends the ordinary. A real letter from the other side. So, if this isn't a legit message from the other side, I'm not sure what is. I don't even know where to start this story. So, I guess I'll start at the beginning. Here it goes. I met the love of my life in 1996 when I was 16 years old. For privacy reasons, we're going to call him John. He was my first love, and in many ways, the only love I've ever known. Fast forward 20 years, and though we hadn't spoken much, and were both married to other people, I could honestly say that I was still head over heels for this guy. Unfortunately, he passed away from cancer a few years back, and the loss was devastating, to say the least. I can't get into all the details, but suffice it to say, John's death robbed me of any hope that I would ever experience real love like that ever again. I could go on and on about this, but I'll skip ahead to the interesting part. A few weeks ago, I was going through a box where I keep pictures, letters, and other things that remind me of John, and all the experiences that we shared. I found a letter I wrote him after he died that I'd completely forgotten about. In the letter, I asked him to show me a sign that he was still around and still with me. I told him that I needed it to be a big sign, one that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Not a flickering light or a simple coincidence. I needed a big, real, unmistakable sign. So I looked up and said out loud, "John, I'm still looking for that sign." Well, a few days later I got a text from my mother. She sent me a picture of an envelope, a junk mail advertisement from a local insurance company. She had received 3 of these advertisements that day. One addressed to her, another to my father, and a third addressed to John's father. Now, John's parents live in the same city as my parents, but they do not live nearby each other. According to Google Maps, there's a 2-mile, which is like a 6-minute drive between their houses. There's a major thoroughfare that divides the city, and my parents live on one side, his parents live on the other. Their addresses are not even close to being similar, so that couldn't have accounted for the mix-up. I obviously can't show the actual addresses, but his address is like 5 Smith Street, and my parents' address is more like 8932 Lakeshore Drive. Not at all similar. Both of our families' last names are unusual and uncommon, and are not spelled or pronounced the same in any way. Again, I can't give too many details, but they are as different as Hamertia and Calcino. Both odd, unusual names, but not even close to being similar. My parents and his parents aren't friends. They don't belong to the same clubs or churches. I don't even think that they're Facebook friends. So, how in God's name did a letter addressed to John's father end up in my parents' mailbox? The town they live in has a population of about 30,000. What are the chances that this letter that was supposed to be delivered 2 miles away ended up in the wrong mailbox? A mailbox that just so happens to belong to my parents. I asked for a sign. He gave me one, right? I mean, I suppose it's possible that the letters got stuck together somehow, as they were being sorted perhaps, but how? They weren't stuck together when my mother found them in the mailbox. And in any case, what are the odds that John's dad's letter would somehow get stuck to one of my parents' letters out of all the other thousands of letters it was being sorted with? Possessed, haunted, mirror, and house. I used to live in a house with my parents, which both myself and my parents had very strange experiences in. However, my parents didn't let me know that they had them, and so they didn't want to spook me any further. My room was particularly bad with the activities that used to happen, and this would be all the time. Just to name a few experiences. There was someone knocking on my door saying my name when everyone was asleep. My guitar plectrum, which is a pick, was thrown at me from across the room, and my guitar was often strung, all 6 strings, all at the same time. Obviously, if a string goes out of tune, sometimes one will strum, but all 6 was definitely no accident. Anyway, I've had this antique mirror for as long as I can remember. It was a past relative's, and I always used to notice handprints and fingerprints on it, even though I never touched it that much. They were everywhere from top to bottom. My parents, obviously not wanting to let me know that they were also aware of the paranormal things going on, said to me, "Don't worry about it. It'll probably was just me touching it. Maybe I was just a mistake I was making." They seemed so sure that this was the case that I forced myself not to think about it, and I would carry on as if nothing weird was happening, which was very hard as something was definitely going on. Eventually, my mom told me that she was also concerned about my mirror and needed to speak to me about something. She'd seen, other than handprints, something else was there. She never showed me the photo that she took because she didn't want to scare me. But she said in the prints on the mirror was a perfect face of a devil. She showed my dad and his friend this before taking a photo, and despite them not wanting to believe in this side of things, they both could see it. Obviously, I didn't know how to react and thought perhaps something was after me. I mean, who knows? Mom decided to get some advice. So she had gone to a shop near me called Spellbound. They sold things of all types, but mainly they were all to do with the supernatural types of things, healing and crystals. As you can imagine, the people who worked there are all very aware of the spiritual world and the other different types of paranormal experiences. So my mom felt this was the best place to get some advice. She spoke to a guy there about my mirror. They said that they had a few options, which were as follows. Smashing the mirror completely to get rid of any negative energy, moving the mirror away from the reflecting on me while I'm sleeping, saging the room for me to wear a black tourmaline, either in a necklace or bracelet form to help protect me. I wasn't worried if we needed to smash the mirror, as I was pretty terrified by this point. However, my parents didn't want to do this, as it used to belong to one of my relatives who wasn't with us anymore. So, my mom brought me back the black tourmaline, and we went on from there. I still noticed the fingerprints and handprints, but not so much strange experiences, so I felt perhaps the tourmaline worked. Mom did go back to Spellbound and spoke to the same guy again regarding that. She thought maybe the tourmaline worked, but there's still handprints where he'd said again. Might just be worth smashing the mirror. He began to explain how mirrors can be portals for demons and another life, and by keeping the mirror, we could potentially be letting them directly into my room, which, he cautioned, was extremely dangerous. My parents still didn't want to smash the mirror. Typical. So I ended up taking it with me when I moved out a few months later with every intention to smash it in my own time without them knowing. Well, when I first moved in, I did use it now and then to get changed while I looked for a new mirror. But I would hang a towel over it when I wasn't using it. Anyways, one day my boyfriend put it up a bit higher in the bathroom to shave or something, I don't know. He made sure it was secured so it had no way of falling. I had put it in the same position before, and I can literally 999.99999% tell you it couldn't have fallen, but as you can probably tell, it did. He left it for literally a few seconds to grab a towel, and within that time, there was a huge bang, then a smash. The mirror had literally shattered into tiny pieces like, even if I wanted to repair it, which I definitely didn't, there would have been no possible way. To this day, I believe that some sort of guardian or angel or fate broke that mirror, because as soon as I moved in with the mirror, the flat felt uneasy, and as soon as we disposed of it, I felt so much better living there. Whether whatever was attached to the mirror followed me to the flat when I took it, I don't know, but nevertheless, I am so glad I'm no longer dealing with that anymore. Please don't ask me about why I didn't smash it sooner. It's hard when you're under 18 living with family, trying to get your way, as I'm sure you're all aware. It was a sick day I'll never forget. It was summer, and I was too sick for summer school that year. So one day my grandma arranged for me to go to my friend's house across the street the next afternoon. I was to stay at her house the night before, so I didn't have to spend all day by myself at my own house, or have my mom drive me in the morning. It was the year 2000-something. I had a great night with my grandma. We played cards and talked and did beads and embroidery all night. Then we went to bed like any other night. I would stay with her during the weekend sometimes, but this particular night, she had to leave for work the next morning. I was a big girl, and I was ready to have half a day alone. So anyway, I got up and had breakfast that morning with my grandma before she went to work at 6 a.m. She told me to have a good day and not to get into trouble, like she did every other time we parted ways. I told her to do the same, and then she said that she would call and wake me up later in case I fell asleep. It was a little early when she left, so I took a nap on her couch thinking if I went back to bed I'd sleep all day and not make it to my friend's house in time for lunch. That was a wee thing. We couldn't have made lunch, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't too comfortable. A while after falling asleep, or so I thought, I felt my blanket fall off of me, and it was cold. So cold that I shot up thinking something was wrong, realizing a few seconds later, the world slowed, and about halfway through sitting, the rest of the way up, a wave of nausea and bone-deep chills hit me as fast as they would fade. I see some movement across the room, quickly go to put on my glasses to see who's home. Excited that it might be my grandpa home from driving truck, fumbled a bit. I find my glasses, put them on, and realize it's still dark outside. I look around, all the lights are on in the living room where I was sleeping, and the ones in my grandma and grandpa's room down the hall were on as well. I don't remember turning them on, but one next to the couch. I then think for sure Papa's home and call out for him as I walk toward the bedroom. No answer. Not a problem. He has a hard time hearing from driving trucks. I take another step. Chills and nausea waves rush over me once more. I was noticing a dial tone on the phone in the bedroom. Suddenly, I was sick to my stomach. I take a hard left before the bedroom into the bathroom, like an instinct. right before throwing up, barely making it to the toilet before vomit erupts out of me like a science experiment gone rogue. A minute later, the nausea spikes and drops as the heat returns to the room, following the figure as it crosses past the open bathroom door with me kneeling in front of the toilet. I'm peering out of the corner of my eye, pretending I didn't see a thing, increasingly tensing up. When it passes fully, I collapse and sit down, waiting for the nausea to pass before venturing out of my current known safe zone. Bang! I hear the door close and the dial tone go from a buzz in a distant room to now being so loud my little self was willed to go and hang it back up, no matter what was going on. I leave the bathroom, go into the bedroom where the blankets on my grandma's side of the bed were folded open, almost perfectly for it to have been done by her. And atop the covers, the phone lay with the line open. The hairs on my back stood up as I grabbed the phone to hang it up. I'm now too scared to be by myself in their house. And with the sun finally coming up, I'm thinking it's 7:30 or so. I leave the house, sat outside until Grandma called later on around 9 to wake me up. I pretend to just be waking up, her not realizing I was sitting outside grasping the garage phone in my hand increasingly tightly for the last hour and a half. I can't recall ever telling anyone besides a school friend about this, let alone my grandmother, for fear that she might not feel safe at home alone without us during the week. I'll never know if it was a home invader or just Bill, the next-door neighbor, coming to grab something and I startled him, so we just left without a word. It may have been the mind of an anemic child riding the line of life and death, or a ghost. I would flatline a week or so later at the hospital from blood loss due to my illness, so who knows? The Reaper might have had his schedule off, came for me at the wrong day, so he just let himself back out the way he came. Who is to say for sure? Am I crazy? My latest experience was pretty tame. I was hanging out with a few friends in between some buildings, where people park their cars, where some storage buildings and a football pitch are located. It's a pretty old area in my city, mostly populated with old people. When we were getting ready to head out, I look up to one of the storage sheds. I see a pure white wispy figure with no discernible features, about 160 centimeters tall, kind of hovering 5 centimeters above the shed's roof. It looked as if it had a cloak over it, like a solid mass, but at the same time translucent. After I double take at it, it faded away rapidly, as if being taken by the wind. It's late at night, and I might have been high on weed, but not enough to hallucinate such a thing. My other occurrence was when I was a little kid. Might have been 6 or 10 years old. Honestly, don't remember. This one is not tame at all and was pretty scary. So much so that I feel obligated to share. I was in my house going from my bedroom to the kitchen to get something. I turn on the light in the hallway where that would be to my right, and that would be the living room. We had one of those big-ass plasma TVs. They weighed a ton. The light from the hallway was just enough to illuminate. It was enough to illuminate the living room pretty confidently. You could see what was going on in there. I first hear some scaried steps coming from there. I couldn't tell the source. At this point, I had just taken my first step into the hallway. I then hear some giggling. I look over and I see a small girl. She was looking at me. I had just come into full view of the living room. She had pigtails and was wearing a dress. I think it was black. I just freeze and stare at her. She now quietly heads over to the TV and hides behind it, When our eyes contacted each other, I just ran into my bedroom and hid underneath the covers. I have had minor experiences all my life until the time where I stopped being afraid of the dark. I would hear my name being shouted on either sides of streets or at home. I would see things move as if there was an air current, like tissues or plants, bed sheets being tugged on, breath on my face while trying to fall asleep. But one day, out of nowhere, I stopped being afraid of the dark. Not by choice, I just woke up and I was no longer afraid. Pennies and dimes. Anyways, when I was 4 years old, my great-grandma died. She was my mom's mom. I remember her a little bit, and I remember finding out that she passed, but I was 4 at that time. I don't think I was ever told this until I was older. But after my great-grandma died, dimes started showing up, randomly. My family member would find them in random places. I don't remember this as I was very young. My great-aunt, who was one of my grandma's sisters, and one of my great-grandma's daughters, apparently after my uncle got in a car accident, she checked the road where it was and everything. There were dimes on the road where the car crashed. Just dimes. When I was 8, my mom's brother, my uncle, he passed away. I was 8, so I remember all of it. But I wasn't super upset by it. Don't get me wrong, I was still really sad I'd lost my uncle, but I was never crying about it. Until recently, after finding out what happened, I've been upset. This isn't about how he died. Now, after he passed, pennies started showing up randomly. My mom would find pennies under her pillow, which doesn't even make sense because she doesn't keep coins in her pocket or near her bed whatsoever. Then, as I got older, I started finding both dimes and pennies myself in odd places. I was 10. It was summertime. My older cousin who lives in another state just had twins, and they're my grandparents' first great-grandchildren. So they went to go see my cousin's wife and his kids. My grandparents have a dog, though, so me and my mom decided to stay at my grandparents' house while they're gone to look after the dog. We didn't stay there all night and all day, but we'd sleep there and stay for little bits during the day. There wasn't much to do one night. We decided to play Monopoly. We set it all up right there. Then the dog wanted to go outside, so we took her outside. When we got back, on the Monopoly board was a dime and a penny. We didn't put them there. No one else was in the house while we were gone. I found dimes on the seat of where I sit on a school bus. And I'll say that my great-grandpa left it for me. But realistically, somebody else was sitting there and it fell out of their pocket. But still, why specifically a dime? Same thing when I find the pennies most of the time. But finding both the dime and a penny on the Monopoly board doesn't make sense. They weren't there before when we went outside. And also, my great-grandparents' house is old. My great-grandparents lived there with my grandma and her siblings. Then my grandparents lived there with my mom and her siblings. So my great-grandma did live there at one time, and so did my uncle. And sometimes I'll even hear footsteps upstairs there when no one's upstairs, and the footsteps are coming from my uncle's room. I still don't have an explanation for what happened. That was a few years ago, and I still think about how the coins got there. Recently, my uncle's death has been, it's been upsetting me. Last Saturday night, a lot of things were upsetting me. My uncle's death being one of them. With all that, I was crying. The next morning, we're going somewhere, as a family would. We were going for a long car ride. So just in case I got really bored, I grabbed a book. When I grabbed the book, a penny came out of it. I haven't touched that book in months. I never put coins in it. I was legitimately about my uncle's death the night before. And then that happens. My very unexplained previous house. This all would have taken place roughly 10 to 11 years ago, over a period of 2 years. We had moved into this older house in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates, after living in another house in a city for 2 years. It was a creepy house, very normal and in a pretty populated area that was gaining more popularity. The house was quite old, built well on the outside and made from concrete, but showing its age on the inside. I never felt anything weird about the house, just annoyed at how often a pipe would leak or paint would need to be touched up. However, I very vividly remember 2 moments in that house. First, I was sleeping in my sister's room with my sister and mother. I must have been around 10 years old, my sister being 5. I didn't like sleeping alone, and neither did my sister, so we often shared rooms with our parents. I remember randomly waking up in the middle of the night, no idea why. After a few minutes of lying there awake, I would hear a surprisingly loud female scream. It scared me. Woke my mother and said, "Do you hear that scream?" To which she would respond, "It was probably just the cats." There were many stray cats that lived in the area, but I knew it wasn't cats. It sounded as if a woman was screaming briefly and definitely sounded as if it came from inside the house, and it wasn't our cat. He'll be asleep with my dad. I eventually fell asleep again, didn't bring it up, never found out what that was. Secondly, one night I was lying in bed with my dad and my mom in another room with my sister. I was trying to fall asleep, and my dad was reading a book. We then both heard what sounded like a large plastic container being dropped. Me and my dad got up to investigate. My sister and mother were asleep, and there was nothing noticeable that had fallen. My dad explained that it was probably our cat that had knocked something over. We went to bed, and the next day I basically ignored the experience again. Didn't talk about it. But we never found any signs of something falling over. After 2 years in the house and no other events happening to me, we moved to another house in the same area. It was newer and bigger. Nothing happened again, but a few years later I bring up my story to my mom one day, who then reveals that I wasn't the only one to experience strange things in that house. She explains how one night when me and my sister were sleeping in our own rooms, my dad had gone to bed to read a book, while my mom stayed in the living room to finish a cup of tea. My dad was lying on his side reading when he vividly remembers feeling my mother get into bed with him. He even said, "You finished that tea quickly." But when he turned around, no one was there. My mother was still drinking tea in the living room, and me and my sister were asleep in our own rooms. He struggled to fall asleep that night. Another time, my mom's friend had come over to meet my mom and see the house for the first time, while me and my sister were at school. My father was at work. My mom's friend, we'll call her Linda, was sitting on the living room while my mom was making coffee for the two of them. Linda then sees my father walk up the stairs to the second floor. She greets my dad. Let's call him John. "Hey, John, good to see you." My mom comes out of the kitchen with coffee and questions who Linda was talking to. Linda says she was greeting my father. But my mother explained how my father was at work. No one else was in the house. Linda was adamant she saw a man walk up to the second floor. My mom and her go upstairs to check, find no one there. Linda left immediately and took a few months before she would come back. Finally, the scariest of them all. My mom was watching my sister while I was at a friend's house. My dad was at work. My sister was playing in her room while my mom read a book in the same room. My mom got up briefly to go to the kitchen to pack some stuff away. When she gets back, my sister is coloring with some crayons. My mom's confused as she keeps the crayons at the top shelf in the cupboard with the door closed, because my sister went through crayons crazy fast. She asked my sister where she got the crayons, to which my sister replied, "The man gave them to me." My mom was alone in the house and had left my 4-year-old sister alone for only 2 minutes. This freaked my mother out a lot. She never told me about it. Told anyone, really. After moving out, many of our friends told my parents of how they disliked coming to our house. They couldn't say why, but said it had a strange feeling to it. My mom never told me about the incidents, as to perhaps not scare me. 10 years later, we haven't experienced anything ever again, but we all still very much remember and dislike talking about that house. Wife saw a dead friend 90 days after he died. Back in 2010-2011, I met a World War II veteran who I became very good friends with. His wife passed away in 2012. Didn't have much of anyone left as he outlived his whole family. His parents were born in the 1880s, and grandparents served in the Civil War. My mother often made dinners for him. We became very close. We spent a lot of time together. He was like a father I didn't have, and I respected and loved him as if he was my own. Fast forward to May of 2021. He had a fall at the nursing home. He broke his hip and a couple of ribs. He later fell again at the nursing home and broke his clavicle, 3 more ribs just a few weeks after his first fall. Sadly, that was the beginning of the end. He stopped eating and drinking and died in mid-July. He always had a fascination of ghosts. Told us a particular ghost story that took place in the 1950s. I remember I asked him to visit me if he could. He said he would try. The last time I saw him, he said, "I love you," passed away shortly after. I was thankful I was there, but I think he held on just long enough for me to, see him, so I wouldn't have to see him pass away. He died 5 minutes after I left. Now, back to the 1950s ghost story. He used to live in Kansas City, around 1953 to 66, in a house that he had thought was haunted. If they had guests over, the guests often felt a presence or had a lingering feeling that something wasn't right. They would sometimes see shadows and hear things too. The house was built on an old Native American graveyard, but the ghosts that haunted their house seemed to be very friendly. My friend always treated the ghost like a member of their family, so maybe the ghost was friendly because of this. One day in 1958, he went upstairs to go check something in the guest room. Opened the door. He got hit with a cold blast of air, and all of the curtains were completely horizontal toward the ceiling. He called his wife over, who always saw it. The curtains remained that way for about 5 minutes before they slowly rested on their own. He left us the house, and we kept it, so we could remember him, keep his legacy alive. I would have dreams about him occasionally, nice dreams too, left me feeling calm and at peace. We would sometimes hear footsteps and doors close in the house, but he didn't pay much attention to it. But one day, I heard a crash in the master bedroom, and the curtains had fallen off the wall somehow. I put them back up, but couldn't figure out how it could have come off the wall. The scariest one was around 3 a.m. in the morning in mid-October. My wife and I were sleeping, and she heard a man talking. She couldn't quite make out what it was, but it sounded like he was telling a story of some sort. Something he always liked to do, by the way. My wife thought it was me talking. I turned around to see what was going on. She realized I was asleep. Saw a shadow man standing next to the window right beside me with a triangular-shaped hat, completely opaque. It even blocked out the light from the side of the window. She got scared and screamed and turned on the light. The figure was still there, but disappeared about 15 seconds later. I woke up and she said I stared right at it, but I didn't see anything. Could this have just been sleep paralysis? She was able to move and talk, but I couldn't see the figure. She always has been a little sensitive to some degree. My apologies about formatting. Reddit is a pain to type on. My kids and I lived in a haunted house from the late 1800s. For the first few months, the house seemed pretty normal. But then one night, my son came screaming down the stairs, in what I would call a night terror. I assume he woke up from a nightmare, and it just kept going. He finally took a deep breath and said, "I was sleepwalking, I'm okay." Went back up to his room. Then the weirdness started. One night I was down in the basement doing laundry. I heard a small child's voice behind me. "Hi there." When I turned around, no one was there. At that point, we started finding toys in the basement in obscure places. My first thought was that the children who lived there before had hidden them in the crevices in the walls. Then one day I noticed a box of old marbles appeared where I'd just cleaned. None of the toys belonged to my kids. I also set up a cheap dollar store alarm system around the office area, so I knew when the kids would sneak into the office to try to find birthday and Christmas presents, little stinkers. They did it often. One day when I was in the bathroom, the alarm went off. I yelled from the bathroom, "Hey, get out of my office." Since my son and I were the only ones home, I heard him yell from upstairs, "I'm not in your office." As time went by, we could hear a piano playing at night that I thought might be the neighbors. Sometimes the lights and ceiling fan would go on and off. I blamed old lighting. The front door would sometimes open if not double locked. I told the women to own the home before the new landlord bought it, as our kids were kind of friends. She told me the reason why she put the double lock on the door is that someone would open the door at night, and the reason she finally sold the house is because of all the weirdness surrounding it, including the piano. And this photograph was pasted over another photograph at the end that I wrote, and it's now gone. After that, we started looking for another place to live. It was during this time that really strange stuff started happening. My kids would feel like they were getting pushed up the stairs when going up. And then one night while my son was asleep in his room, he heard an old woman's raspy whisper from the closet saying, "I'm gonna kill you." The kids would see shadows of figures going from out back in the porch area to the small building that belonged to our old house next door that was supposedly a candy store. It had burned up inside years before, but the outside remained undamaged. At this point, we moved. Strange feeling. Okay, guys and girls, probably many people have this feeling and ask about it here, but I have to talk about it. Every time I have strange feelings about being watched. At day I can ignore this, but the worst are nights. I feel this even in rooms where I have all the doors closed. I have dreams which ones I feel are really realistic, and sometimes I miss some people from those dreams, but I never seen these people. And the most important, I have strange luck in my life. Once I drank too much and finished hanging above a fence with spikes. Once I slept in a car where I drive with 100 kilometers an hour and end up in a trench, but somehow I get through it. Cars look like a total disaster, but I made it. I remember when I wake up because I drive through Chainage Post and going down through the trench. Now this was a little divine altar, but next day when I go there was nothing destroyed. Everything was good, like I was never there, but my car was still full of grass and scratches. That's my dog. In other times, I had a really bad year and tried to end myself. And I'd take some sleeping pills and drink with 2 beers. But I think it was just too small of a dose. Once I read something about a multiverse, or something like that. Not sure if there's a different name for that in English. And if you die here, you still live in another dimension, and that one goes on. And also I heard many stories about some kind of spiritual guardian. I'm very skeptical, and I know I'll never find answers for sure, but I'm curious if anybody has the same feeling or has ever read or heard more about answers of these things. Connected mentally to aliens, or beings from another dimension, and saw proof in 3D normal physical plane. I'm 24 years old, and since when I was born, I was always interested in the philosophy of mind religions and why they exist. I was always a rational, scientific person, until when I was 23 years old. Little backstory first. My vision has always been extremely good. Never wore glasses or lenses. Always a very visual person. One of those guys who constantly stops to look at trees because, like many of you, I'm sure, I recognize the sacredness in everything. I was always quite spiritual. Without even knowing what the spirit even is. I always felt also that my session of free thinking were guided by someone that wasn't me. Since when I was a kid, I always used my imagination, and I always was interested about the first-person experience. Mostly because I feel like the realms of philosophy and religion and science will one day merge. So, since I was a kid, I always used my mind for what it is, a viewer. I always felt kind of guided in my thinking. I would see images, concepts, answers to questions I had about society and religion and so on. I always felt like I knew something else before my birth, but never paid much attention to these thoughts, telling myself they weren't really real. When I was 21, I finally started to take meditation more seriously. And my exploration into my mind received a great upgrade. At 23 years old, I started to realize that the UFO phenomenon, to which I had always felt attracted to, was probably real. One day I was discussing this with my family at dinner. Of course, the members of my family were kind of surprised by the subject because they always saw me as maybe a more smart person and UFOs are for crazy people, according to popular belief. So mentally I told my guides in my mind, I said, if you really exist, and I'm not talking to myself right now, that means you can listen to this. And if you can listen to this, you can show yourself to me. Now, if you do, I will give my life to this cause. If you do not, I'll get family and I will presume that I should do what my human peers tell me. Materialize on this physical plane so I can see with my own eyes. Or the party's over and I'll forget you forever. Next morning I was up at 4:30 in the morning. I didn't use cannabis the night before, so I was completely sober. I went upstairs and made a coffee. I had the intention of working out. I started to walk toward the park, and not even a minute into the walk, I see my first UFO in my life. It was 5:02 in the morning of the 23rd of September of 2021. My heart started racing. I knew that they were them, my guides. I saw these 4 lights in the sky flying very fast in formation. Then the formation broke and they spiraled amongst themselves. They disappeared one after another, extremely fast, extremely close, and almost magical. Absolutely no sound at all, and it couldn't be a satellite. I always look up and always know what I'm looking at. After some months of realizations, I asked them in my head to give me the answers of what this place, Earth, is. They told me mentally. Alien Interview from Roswell Crash, written by Matilda. I didn't know the book or its title before asking, of course. They didn't really tell me with words, but more like with images. I found the book and read it, and I was floored. I still don't know if these aliens are manipulating us and me, and they're actually enemies. But they're so subtle, and they respect our free will so much that they don't give me this impression. It feels like they want to help us all. In the book, they basically told us that we're immortal spiritual beings, that we're trapped here because we're imprisoned. You cannot kill one like us, so you can only trap them. In the book, my favorite quote is, I sense your disbelief about you being a spiritual being. You want the proof of that? Be above your head now. For the first moment of my life, I realized the obvious. I am not my head or my body. I became aware that Errol, the alien, is an immortal spiritual being, and so are we all. Basically, according to Errol, we cannot remember our past lives because the people controlling Earth makes us go toward light that erases your spiritual awareness. And then on Earth, through mind control and false memories installed by the people we love, they ensure we cannot remember who we are and where we come from. Read the book before dismissing it, as it's kind of written in the preface. What is true for you is true for you. An aswang stalked me. An aswang is a monster in Filipino mythology that preys on pregnant women. Unlike the grisly attacks that usually are shown in horror movies, however, these monsters apparently just prey on the life essence of the unborn baby until it dies and the mother miscarries. The scary part is that these monsters are also part human, meaning they could literally be anyone during the day. This happened in Metro Manila around 2011. My cousin told me. The old man with the new neighbors asked me if you were pregnant. I was shocked and never even told my family yet. I was 21, I worked nights in a call center. I never go outside when I'm home, and I was only a few weeks along, so I know I wasn't showing yet. How did this nosy old man know? The said neighbors were new in town, coming from one of the more popular provinces in the Philippines where witchcraft and aswangs are still the norm. They were friendly enough, though, so no one really had anything bad to say about them other than the nasty rumor that they know about aswang. When I was about 8 months along, I was watching late-night TV with my brother at around 2 a.m. Something big landed on our little tin roof, strong enough to rattle the windows. My brother and I looked at each other with wide eyes as we listened to the footsteps. Yeah, footsteps stop right on top of me. I was never a prayerful person, but at that moment I called on gods and saints and angels to protect my baby. Then I remembered my grandmother's story about how she escaped an aswang attack by placing a pillow between her legs to mask the baby's scent. So, I did just that. We had no idea how long we waited, seconds, minutes, but we heard another jump. Then, silence. Until this day, I was glad that my brother was with me to vouch for me. I still couldn't believe it happened, and it happened to me. Then I remembered the nosy old man. Could it have been him? Something weird and mysterious and unfinished, I suppose. A creepy phone call. This happened around 8 or 9 years ago. I was in a mall with my daughter, and as a weekend treat, decided to go to a local cape shop to sample a slice of their chocolate mousse. A few minutes after getting seated, my phone rang. It said my sister was calling. She was at work at the time and wasn't allowed phones in the production area, so I was concerned that it may be important. When I picked up and said hello, a really creepy and really oily voice I didn't recognize said, "Oh, so you're just here eating cake, are you?" I think I may have said a few other things, asked the name and why they were calling, something like that. The voice just laughed and laughed. It was difficult to identify as male or female. All I know was that it was really, really wrong. I looked around and remember thinking that I was probably a victim of one of those gag shows. But then again, why go through all the effort of using my sister's name and number just for a prank call? I hung up and looked at my daughter. She was still eating cake. The people around us were minding their own business. The world stayed the same. My little cousin has a strong connection with departed ones. My little cousin, the son of my mother's sister, was born diagnosed with hemangioma as an infant. Hemangioma is when an infant during their first few weeks of life has an excess of blood vessels. This causes a rubbery reddish bump. My cousin had his on his left cheek, which caused a massive amount of inflammation. His left cheek was visibly larger than the right. 1 year before his birth, his grandmother passed away due to cancer, and that apparently grew on her left cheek, literally the same spot as my cousin's hemangioma. My mother is she's of Japanese descent. and she's a firm believer of reincarnation. The rest of the family, however, isn't as religious, and we didn't see it as a big deal. We just thought it was some one-in-a-million coincidence. 2 years after his birth, however, we were showing my little cousin pictures of the family. We happened to come across a picture of my late grandmother, the one I mentioned earlier. My cousin then proceeds to point at my grandmother and says, "Look, Mommy, it's me." What are the odds of that? Also, when my cousin was 2, my grandfather passed away. My cousin lives in the States, and I live in the Philippines. When my grandfather passed, my cousin's family came to the Philippines for his wake. We have a condo unit in Manila. We would bring my grandfather along with us there a couple of times, liked playing in the casinos nearby. He had his own room that only he would use when he would stay there. As his funeral location was closer to our condominium than our main home, we decided to stay there the night before the funeral. All rooms were full due to relatives from the US. Since I didn't want to sleep in the couch, I decided to sleep in my recently departed grandfather's room. It was my cousin's first time in our condominium. The morning after, during breakfast, while my mom and her sister were laughing, my cousin, out of nowhere, says, "Shh, Grampy's still sleeping," while pointing toward the room I just slept in. Note that it was his first time there. Nobody ever told him that it was my grandfather's room. But we have a belief in the Philippines that infants and toddlers could see ghosts, and I'm quite convinced after all of that. Spooky story, get spooky evidence. My grandpa bought an old small house on a mountain like 60 years ago with a lot of forest. As he bought it, there was already a lot of talking in town about it being haunted. The story behind this house is that a hunter and his family lived in there, and he got killed in a quote-unquote hunting accident, which was more likely a murder. His wife, not able to keep the family together, killed herself in the cellar. At first, I thought all that was just clever marketing, because he rents it out to other people in the summer, even though I've also heard the priest talk about this place independently. So, now, on to the paranormal stuff. There's a guest book in which people can write how they enjoyed their stay, so on and so forth. And a few people even know the legends of what happened there and make jokes about that. Perhaps they would say things like, "The ghost was friendly this night," things like that. But there's also a lot of entries of people from other parts of the world who couldn't possibly have known what happened there. They were always writing about the same things. Very, very loud steps from the cellar and outside, asking if somebody was here at the time, a very bright light from the middle of the forest and in the middle of the night. There's at least 10 acres of forest in each direction, and rarely some white-dressed woman walking in that forest. Now on to a personal experience. I've never believed in anything like that. That's why sometimes I slept up there myself. I've always heard the steps, but never saw a light or a woman in the forest. This one night, though, was different. I woke up at 3 a.m. in the morning and needed to take a piss. I still don't know why, but I decided to go outside instead of the very nice wash closet we have indoors. As I started, suddenly an extremely bright light shined directly in my face, ran to my car, never slept up there again. I feel like I'm going crazy with the amount of strange noises and things I see at night. Before I get into my experiences, I need to give you a picture of where I live. I live in Arkansas, about 20 minutes from a very small town and 40 minutes away from Fort Smith. My fiance and I live in a 1-acre plot of land quite a ways from the highway, surrounded by trees. We have neighbors, but none super close to us. My fiance's father and grandfather live on this land with us, but they're in their own separate buildings. The first experience happened about 2 months ago. My fiance and I were hanging out together because she was off that day. She works from a turkey packaging plant, and it's gone from 2 p.m. to anywhere around 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. We heard a lot of rustling and movement in the bushes and trees next to our small house. So I went onto the porch with my flashlight, wanted to see what was up. I'm still hearing the sounds, but not seeing anything, so I just brush it off, go back inside. Well, the next day she tells me her grandpa heard stuff too, saw 2 glowing red eyes in the trees. He tells her whatever it was taller than him, and he's 6 foot. I hear scraping on my metal roof, which I suppose could be branches, but the times I hear it, there's no wind. A few times I've heard light tapping on the side of my house. Sometimes I think I hear voices outside, but I'm always watching stuff on my phone or playing video games, so I always try to brush it off as me just hearing things. My grandfather has a dog who roams around the property at night when he forgets to bring him in and falls asleep. Fluffy has been barking randomly at night, sometimes for a few minutes to a few hours. A few nights ago, I let my dog out to use the bathroom. I have 2 leads for them, mostly because I can't trust them not to run off. I notice while I'm getting my St. Bernard off a leash that my husky's starting up the driveway at something. I can't see it. A few seconds later, she just starts cowering like she's scared, ends up peeing where she is. So I yell at her to get inside, which she does, and I start taking her lead off when I notice Fluffy race up the driveway and start barking. I book it inside. My husky immediately runs into her kennel, wouldn't come out the rest of the night. Not even for a treat that my fiancé, who she adores. The day after the incident with my husky, I again let the dogs out, and as I'm letting my dogs back in, I notice 2 red glowing dots through my neighbor's fence that's about 30 feet away. And from the positioning, I can tell that they're 4 to 5 feet off the ground. I try not to freak out. I do my best to calmly get my dogs back inside, where I almost have a panic attack. This was at 7:30 p.m. My fiancé got home around 11 p.m., where I gained the courage to go back out with my dogs, where the lights were still there. When I went to investigate the next day, they were gone, and that night, no lights. Yesterday, I let both my dogs out again. And we were out there for a few minutes when my fiancé comes rushing out and asks me if I'm okay. Apparently, she heard a loud noise like I fell, and like my St. Bernard yelped like he was injured. I got freaked out and told her to stay outside with me, where she tells me how quiet it is outside and how she's getting a bad feeling. That's everything I can remember at the moment. I don't know what's happening. Honestly, I feel like I'm going crazy. If anybody has any answers or similar experiences, please leave a comment. I'll answer any questions as best I can. What the hell happened to me? Was I really sleepwalking, or was it something else? This happened around somewhere between the ages of 9 and 11. My mother, little sister, and I used to live in another city, but would come back down to our hometown every weekend. We would stay at my grandmother's house. Bit of backstory. I've always been scared of my grandmother's house. Bit hard to explain as I never really saw anything in her house. Just would always feel this horrible fear. It would be in the pit of my stomach like something bad was about to happen. Prior to us moving to another city, I would stay down at my grandma's house a lot, especially around the weekends as a child. She had 2 bedrooms upstairs, but had a bed downstairs in the living room because it was difficult for her to climb the stairs. I would always share my grandma's bed downstairs. I was too scared to sleep upstairs. Even after we had moved and all 3 of us would come down to visit and stay the weekend, my mother and sister would sleep upstairs, but I still refused to sleep upstairs with them. I always slept with my grandma. Never really had any issues other than breaking out in a cold sweat from fear, but this night was different. Bit more backstory is prominent to the story. I have an older sister who wasn't living with us and still lived in our hometown. She was meant to be coming down the next day to visit us. This is where it starts to get strange. I remember sitting up and getting out of the bed in the middle of the night, thinking that my sister was outside. The weird thing is, it was almost as if something was speaking to me, through me. I could have sworn I was talking to myself out loud. I got up and said, "Big sis is outside." And then I had to open the door to her. So I started walking, making my way to the front door. Another backstory. This is the last one, I promise. So my grandma's house layout was a bit odd. She had another room that we called the front room, where the front door was. So it kind of went front door, front room, living room. I hated the front room because it had faulty wiring. Didn't mind it during the day, but during the evening and night, I loathed it. It would always be, I would always be told to go in there and grab something for someone. I'd run in, turn on a light, and quickly try to grab whatever I needed to get and run out. Mostly due to the faulty wiring, but every time you turn on the light, it would go out for a few seconds. Then when it did, it would literally freeze, and I would be frozen in fear. Then a few seconds later, it would come back on. All of this, along with my fear of the entire house. I hated this room especially. So, going back to the story. As I'm making my way through the living room, I start approaching the front room. That's when fear starts setting in. It was pitch black in the front room, and I really didn't want to go in there, as I was scared of the room, especially at night, like I said. So I tried my best to stop myself from entering the front room, but I had no control over my body. It was like I was a puppet on strings. The only thing I could move slightly were my eyeballs. So by now I had made my way to the end of the front room. I unlocked the front door, opened it, stepped out, briefly looked around in search of my older sister. I think this must have been around autumn or winter time because a big gust of wind blew in my face and I regained control over my body. As soon as that had all happened, my grandma came frantically running out after me to bring me back into the house. They then started hiding the front door keys from me. Here's what confuses me the most. I've never had a history of sleepwalking. I've never sleepwalked prior to the situation, and I never sleepwalked after. It was only ever this once. Another thing that confuses me is that I always was under the assumption that sleepwalkers are really, never really aware of what's going on. And I feel like I was the most part aware. I just couldn't do anything about it, as it wasn't in my control. Another thing I think might be worth mentioning, although this might be reaching, and it might just sound insane within itself. It's that black magic is practiced a lot within my family. It doesn't help that my mother's sisters doesn't really get along well and probably all do weird-ass spells against each other for their own personal gains. The relationship between their mother, my grandma, was also a bit sticky. They would all compete against one another to be her favorite, so my grandmother's house was probably Hogwarts. This incident has always been on my mind, and I've always wondered what to do and what actually was happening to me because deep down, I've always never believed it was just sleepwalking. Whether it's something paranormal or something to do with black magic or witchcraft, or just some sleeping disorder that I'm not aware I have or had. Maybe it just got activated due to stress. Can somebody please explain this? For some context, I'm the joint youngest of my mom's children, being one of 5 with a twin brother. However, I have 12 siblings altogether, but all the others aside from me, my twin brother and the 3 others share both the same mother and father. I'm not sure if it's relevant, but just to lay it all out there. As a child, I was fascinated with the paranormal. I fully understood at a young age what a spirit and her ghost was. My Nan would talk about her many experiences. She's not a woman to lie. But that's a story for another time, if anybody's interested in hearing that. Before the encounter I'm about to tell you about, I hadn't had really any relay or remember. So, just some spooky things that myself or one of my siblings apparently did or said. But like I said, can't really remember them, so I don't think they're worth mentioning. On to the story anyhow. I was roughly about 7 years old when my mom last minute decided to take me to work with her. She owned her own business, and I didn't want to stay at home with my older sister. My sister was asleep with me and my mom left, wasn't aware that I wasn't at home. From my twin brother and sister's point of view, this is what happened. Annalise woke up. She yelled to the top of the stairs for me and my brother to come down and help tidy up. My brother apparently came straight down and helped. Meanwhile, my sister yelled once again, "Come down and help now," while threatening to confiscate my computer or phone, especially if I continued to ignore her. Got angry and she shouted, "Lily!" Again, and instead of being met with silence this time, she heard, quote-unquote, me respond, "I don't care," and also, "Go away." She heard this clearly and turned to my twin brother Daniel and promptly asked, "What's wrong with her?" My twin brother, having also heard, quote-unquote, me respond from upstairs, just shrugged. My sister left it alone and continued with some house chores alongside my brother. A couple of hours later, me and our mom came into the house. Before I could even take another step, Annalise came up to me and angrily said, "What was wrong with you earlier?" I asked, "What?" Genuinely confused as to what she was referring to. Annoyed, she rolled her eyes at me and said, "You didn't have to give me such attitude earlier. I only asked you to help tidy up." At this point, I was extremely confused and not really being confidential or argumentative person. I started to get upset as that was usually my response to being yelled at. Our mom, who was just as confused as me, asked Annalise what she was going on about, to which Annalise responded, "She wouldn't help clean up earlier." I called her name, and she was rude back to me. I looked at her mother with a pleading look and then back at my sister. "You're lying." "I've been with Mom all day at work." My sister, taken aback by this, raised a brow and looked at me, then also at our mom, who nodded. We left this morning. I remember seeing my sister's angry expression fade. She made a look that seemed as though she was deep in thought before telling us what she'd heard and why she assumed I'd been home. My twin brother later confirmed that he also heard my voice earlier that day. I always doubted Annalise and Daniel's version of the events that day, as although I was interested in the paranormal, I was still afraid of the thought of a ghost being in our house. Well, the doubt continued until one night I was home alone. It was 2016, and I was 13. I used to play this game that doesn't really exist anymore, Small Worlds. Not that it's relevant, but I'd spend most nights on this game. I was hooked. Being home alone didn't really faze me, though I was a little sketched out as we lived next to these woods. I felt our dog would keep me safe, despite only being this little Jack Russell. Anyway, back to the main point. A few hours into gaming and listening to music, my dog was sat on my bed asleep, and I heard the front door downstairs open and somebody walk in. Not thinking anything of it, I shouted downstairs, "Annalise." No response. So I said my other siblings' names, expecting to hear one of them. I shrugged, not thinking much of it, and headed to my room. I picked up my phone and texted my older brother Blake, asked him if he'd just come in or not, as well as sending the same message to Annalise and to my other older sister Katie, my twin brother Daniel. Another few minutes passed, and I decided to just go down and check. Nobody's responded to me yet, so as I get up to the landing, I hear my sister shout up, "It's just me, don't worry." And the footsteps descending into her bedroom, which was on the other side of the house downstairs. It was Annalise who I had heard. Felt a little better about it, but still had a weird feeling that I couldn't explain in my stomach. I decided to go downstairs and make a hot chocolate. While flicking the kettle on, I shouted, "Annie, do you want a hot chocolate?" "I'm making one." No response. A little annoyed, I opened the door and through the small corridor, and I opened her door. Before I could even say anything, I noticed that her room was empty. Freaked out at this point. Thought maybe she just went back out and tried to rationalize everything. I went back to the kitchen, and that's when I saw something that made my heart drop into my stomach. The front door key. It was on the kitchen cabinet, untouched and unmoved from where my mom had left it. Feeling sick at this point, I tried to handle to the front door. To my horror, it was locked. This freaked me out so much because remember earlier when I said I heard that door open and footsteps come in? Yeah. I thought, screw the hot chocolate. Made a beeline for the stairs, getting back into my bedroom and shutting the door once myself and my pup were safely inside. I went to grab my phone to ring one of my siblings or my mom. To my disbelief, all of my siblings had replied saying that they hadn't come home. I called Annalise, wanting this to be some sort of stupid prank that she was trying to pull, as it was her that I heard. To my surprise, she answered. She never answers the phone, by the way. She said, "What's wrong?" I said rather abruptly, "Did you just come home?" My sister sighed, as if I'd asked the stupidest question in the world, and replied, "Can you not hear the background?" With that, I listened. It was rather obvious that she was at a party. At this point, I began to cry as I told her what had happened. She comforted me to the best that she could. She said she'd make her way home shortly, and to just stay in my bedroom. Nothing else happened that night. But when my sisters got home, she asked me if I remembered that day. She told me what happened when I was about 7. And as if I had just unlocked memories I didn't realize were still there, I said, Yeah, I actually do. And we just shared a look of slight disturbance. It was after that night I fully believed my sister's version of the events that day, that she had heard me despite me not being home. There were a few other smaller instances of the same thing. My brother, using the bathroom, realizing there was no toilet paper, had shouted from one of my brothers to go grab him some. He heard my twin brother shout, "Okay." And then, well, nothing. And then my brother realized that we were all at school and nobody else was home. He was supposed to be at school too, but he was skipping. And to clarify, in all of these stories, the person whose voice had been heard was not home. I've only told this story once or twice, and I'm usually met with people saying that it didn't happen and that I'm lying. But I know for sure what I heard that night, and I believe my sister and my brother heard what they did too. However, I'm 18 now. I still can't figure out what this was. If anybody can give me their opinions, or have had a similar experience, I'd be super grateful. It's been sitting heavy on me for years, not knowing.